Chapter 3. I read as much of the article as I could before the man and his newspaper alighted from the omnibus. It claimed that very little was known about the outlaw, not even his name. He'd been dubbed Dark Rider by the Las Vegas Gazette because no one had seen his face, and his crimes were committed during the night. Dark Rider had held up stagecoaches, stolen horses, and murdered a lawman who'd tracked him down. A colourful account of the aborted arrest took up most of the article, but what caught my eye was the final paragraph. A reward of $2,000 was being offered for his capture. I didn't know how much that was in English money, but it was an impressive number. It had to be more than the pound's worth of coins now sitting in my reticule. I couldn't stop thinking about it and the outlaw the rest of the way to the Mason's house. "Of course you can stay," Catherine said when she led me to the kitchen. "Can't she, Mamma?" Mrs. Mason smiled a weak greeting, then pounded her fist into a mound of dough. "Long as your father doesn't mind. Why would he mind? Indy's my oldest friend and she needs us now." Catherine squeezed my hand and rolled her eyes. "He'll be home shortly," Mrs. Mason said, giving the dough a particularly heavy beating. The Masons kept no maid, and whenever I saw Catherine or her mother, they wore aprons and could be found in the kitchen. The house was perpetually full of delicious smells. "I don't want to be any trouble." I nibbled on my lower lip. Perhaps my coming here had been a mistake. The Masons didn't have much charity to offer. "It'll only be for the night. I'll sleep on the floor and eat the scraps from the table. Oh, and I can pay you. My new employer gave me a week's wages in advance." Mrs. Mason stopped kneading. "A penny or two would help to ease Mr. Mason's mind?" She smiled more genuinely this time. "You're a sweet friend to our Catherine and always welcome here. It's just that—" She shook her head and glanced at the door. "What is it, Mamma?" Catherine prompted. "You're a young woman, India, and we have 2 impressionable young men in the house still, that's all." "Oh, I didn't think about that," I said. Catherine laughed. "Ronnie and Gareth don't interest India in the least, Mamma. She can do quite a bit better than my dull-witted brothers." Her mother returned to her dough. "Even so." "Ronnie and Gareth are like brothers to me," I said. Hopefully it was enough to reassure her that I wasn't about to trap her sons into marriage. Admittedly, it stung that she thought I would. She must also know that her sons would have no interest in me, no matter what methods I used to trap them. Like Catherine, the Mason boys were all attractive and fair. They could have their pick of girls. I was too old for them, and too plain with my straight brown hair, short stature, and a waist that refused to shrink to a more fashionable size, no matter how tightly I pulled my corset laces. Catherine led me by the hand up the stairs to her room. She shut the door and tossed herself onto the bed. She patted the mattress beside her. "Ronnie heard a rumour that you confronted Eddie. Is that so? Tell me what happened." Her long, pale lashes fanned over her big blue eyes in innocent wonder. It was not surprising that she had several suitors vying for her hand. A few years younger than me, and quite a lot taller and prettier, the youths always followed her about like puppies. She seemed to enjoy the attention, but I expected it must get tiresome after a while. "I tried," I told her. "I did manage to ruin a transaction with his customer." Although I was no longer sure if Mr. Glass was there to purchase a watch after all. Catherine giggled into her hand. "Good for you. That horrible little man is... well, he's horrid. Father is refusing to send any custom his way now, even if it's something we don't stock and he knows Hardacre's does. Your father is an honourable man." She placed her hand over mine on my lap and gave me a sympathetic smile. "I'm glad you still think so. I know it wasn't easy to forgive him after the guild made their decision, but he had to go along with the majority." "I don't blame him." I must have sounded convincing because she seemed to believe me. The truth was, I did blame Mr. Mason for not standing up to them. Father had said he'd sat quietly and not said a word during the meeting among the senior guild members, at which my application for membership had been tabled. A mere week before that, Mr. Mason had urged me to apply. The about-face baffled me. The relationship between our two families had never been quite the same again, although my friendship with Catherine remained unchanged, thank goodness. I knew so few other women of similar age that the loss of her friendship would have been worse than my broken engagement to Eddie. "Tell me about your new position," Catherine said. "Does it involve watches?" "In a way." "Good. You've got a knack for fine repair work, so Father says. He was quite impressed by how quickly you learned everything. He used to hold you up as an example of why women ought to be allowed to perform men's work if they chose." She screwed up her nose. "Sorry, India, but I'm glad he stopped all that. I began to feel quite inadequate next to your perfection." "I'm hardly perfect," I scoffed. "Father has always appreciated brains over beauty." She patted her bouncy blonde curls. "Some men do, you know," she added, as if such men were a rarity. "Most prefer a little of both," I said, laughing, "but not too much of either." She broke into giggles again. "We'd be quite the combination if we were one person," I said, still smiling. "With your looks and my watchmaking skills, we'd have all the gentlemen for miles around purchasing our watches." "Stop putting yourself down like that, India." She nudged my elbow. "You're pretty. I don't know why you think you're not." "Because next to you, I'm not." "Bollocks." She giggled at the crass word. "That Eddie Hardacre has a lot to answer for, always putting you down the way he did. I don't know what you saw in him." "Nor do I said on a sigh. "I suppose it was because he was the first man to pay me much attention and the first to ask me to marry him." "He was only the first because you intimidate most other men." "I do not. You do. Ask Ronnie and Gareth. You frighten them to death." "That's because I don't fall at their feet and run hither and thither to please them like other girls. That and your quick tongue. They think you're going to tease them." I rolled my eyes, but her words were quite a shock. Did men truly find me intimidating? All men, or just pretty brainless twits like her younger brothers? "Where's the shop located?" she asked. At my blank look, she added, "The shop where you'll be working." "It's not a shop. It's a short-term commission to help a gentleman find a certain watchmaker he met some years ago. I know it sounds odd," I said when she blinked back at me, "but the gentleman seems very nice and he's paying well. The work won't be much, and I can continue to make inquiries for further employment while I'm driven to every watchmaker in the city." "See what I mean? I would never have thought of that. How clever of you. So," she nudged me again, "is this gentleman handsome?" "Very. He's also amiable and wealthy. We had tea at Brown's." She gasped. "Then you must wear something prettier than that old dress." She jumped up and opened the drawer where she kept her gowns. "Catherine, I won't fit into any of your clothes." "Oh." She closed the drawer and regarded me with a critical eye. "Then we'll do something with your hair. I've been wanting to modernise your style for some time." I sighed and succumbed to her ministrations. She plucked out the pins and ran her hands through the tresses. "Your handsome gentleman employer will be surprised to see you tomorrow. I think we can cinch your waist a little more too." I groaned. "He's not a prospect, Catherine." "Every unattached man is a prospect." She paused, her hands in my hair. "He isn't married, is he?" "He didn't mention a wife, but I didn't ask." "You must find out for certain, first thing. Now what else can you tell me about him?" I told her his name and that he was American with possibly some English heritage. She oohed and ahed, as I thought she would, and bounced on her toes when I told her he had a house in Mayfair. I told her everything I remembered from our conversation. I didn't tell her there was quite a good chance he was a Wild West outlaw on the run. "She shouldn't stay here." Mr. Mason's hissed voice could hardly be heard over the clatter of pots and pans in the kitchen as Mrs. Mason washed dishes. He had dismissed all of us except his wife after the evening meal. Throughout dinner, he'd cast odd looks my way, as if he was seeing me in a new light. was so strange that I'd almost asked him if something was amiss, but decided against it. It must simply feel peculiar having me stay in his house without Father, and perhaps he missed Father's company too. I'd returned to the kitchen for a drink, but stopped upon hearing Mr. Mason's whisper. "She's too close to Catherine," he went on. "India's a good girl, sensible," Mrs. Mason said. "Catherine could learn a thing or two from her." I leaned closer. "You don't understand," he said heavily. Although I couldn't see him, I pictured him sitting at the table, running his hands over his bald head. "Then explain it to me." I can't." A chair scraped and footsteps approached. I hid in a dark recess and waited for him to leave before I returned to Catherine's room. My feet felt like logs, my heart sore. Why didn't Mr. Mason want me here? Was I truly a threat to his sons? Did he think me no longer a virtuous woman now that my father was gone? I could think of no other reason. Nothing else had changed since I'd last seen him. So why did he no longer want me near his family? "You didn't bring up the jug," Catherine said when I returned to her room. "I'm no longer thirsty." The noses of the entire Mason household were pressed against the front window when Mr. Glass arrived in his carriage. The men tossed out words like coupler, shafts, and axles, as if they were coach builders, not watchmakers, while the women argued about how much he must earn a year to own such a handsome conveyance. I opened the door and went out to greet him.
"Good morning, miss,"
said Cyclops from the driver's seat.
"Forgive me for not coming down, but I only got one good foot left, and I don't want to risk it."
He flashed a grin as wide as his face and tugged on his cap. Someone smelling of bacon sidled up behind me. "India," Mrs. Mason whispered in my ear. "As a respectable woman and good friend to your poor departed parents, I feel that it's my duty to make sure you know what you're doing." "Why now? You were aware that Mr. Glass was collecting me yesterday." "Yes, well, now I've seen his coachman and I'm having doubts. Are you sure he's not a pirate? He's only got one eye." "I don't think pirates have such nice smiles." My flippant response may have been to tease her a little, but in truth my heart was hammering. It wasn't in my character to ride in carriages with strange men. If my parents were here, they'd disallow it or insist on coming along. I knew the Masons wouldn't treat me the way they treat their own daughter, but it was kind of Mrs. Mason to act as my conscience. On this occasion, however, I was going to ignore it. I couldn't afford to be cautious. It wasn't just the pound that was at stake anymore. It was the 2,000 American dollars. Mr. Glass's long legs unfolded from the cabin and he stepped onto the pavement. "Good morning, Miss Steele. Mr. Mason," he added, holding his hand out to Catherine's father. "Pleased to meet you again, sir." Mr. Mason had avoided me all morning. Well, perhaps not avoided me. He'd gone to his workshop before I'd woken. While I wanted to know for certain why he no longer thought me a good influence on Catherine, I also didn't want to be told to my face that I was a poor example. My stretched nerves couldn't take any more strain. Besides, I was grateful not to have been thrown out of the house. Mr. Glass shook the hand of each member of the Mason family as the head of the household introduced them.
"You still looking for your watchmaker?"
Mr. Mason asked. "I am," Mr. Glass said.
"My offer from yesterday still stands. I'll see if I can repair it for you."
"Thank you, but I prefer the original watchmaker himself to do it."
"Most watches don't differ greatly from one another, you know. I'm sure I can manage to work it out if it's one I haven't seen before."
He laughed a little nervously, making his jowls shake. "Not this watch." Mr. Glass folded the carriage step down for me, then held out his hand. "Where to first, Miss Steele?" "Oxford Street, at the Marble Arch end," I said. "Do you know where that is, Mr. Cyclops? It's not far from Mayfair." Cyclops studied a dirty and much crumpled map spread out on his lap.
I know it, and it's just Cyclops, miss, no mister.
Mr. Mason clasped the button edge of his waistcoat over his stomach. Mrs. Mason was an excellent seamstress and could modify a great many items of clothing, but she couldn't make her husband's waistcoat larger to fit over his increasing girth.
What makes this watch particularly special?
Mr. Mason pressed. The nervous laughter had died, and he now seemed anxious to catch every word that fell from Mr. Glass's lips. Mr. Glass bestowed a smile on him, but his shoulders had gone quite rigid. If I knew that, I wouldn't need to find the original watchmaker. I climbed in, and Gareth folded up the step and closed the door. Cyclops had the horse pulling away from the curb before Mr. Mason could speak another word. The poor man stood there, his mouth open, his eyes darting between Mr. Glass and me. He'd gone a little pale, which hadn't escaped his wife's notice. She clutched his arm, but he seemed not to register her presence. I waved to Catherine through the window and tried not to show her how anxious I felt. By the look on her face, she was anxious enough for us both. Mr. Glass angled his legs so that they did not touch my skirts. I hope you're refreshed, Miss Steele. We've a lot to do this morning. There are several watchmakers in and around Oxford Street, I said. Cyclops can remain near Marble Arch and we can walk from there. It will take longer than the morning, however. As you said, there's a lot to do. He leaned his elbow on the window edge and rubbed the back of his finger over his lips in thought. Shadows flickered through his tired eyes. We can return this afternoon after luncheon. There are some excellent chop houses in the area. We can dine at one of those and resume our investigation immediately. I prefer to return home for an hour or two. I was about to protest that no one needed that long to eat luncheon, but held it in check. Perhaps long lunches were an American custom. It wasn't my place to disagree with him when he was paying me. Nor was it my place to ask him why he was so tired this morning, although the curiosity would probably force me to at some point during the day. As you wish, Mr. Glass, I said. But we do have quite a lot of watchmakers to visit, and I require some time to myself. For shopping? For making inquiries at employment agencies, as well as lodging houses. He arched his brows. You're not staying with the Masons? I had to tell him at some point that he wouldn't be collecting me from there tomorrow morning, but I hesitated nevertheless. In the end, I could only do it while not looking directly at him. I don't want to inconvenience the Masons any more than I have. He was silent a long time, in which I could feel his gaze on me, as I pretended to take interest in the passing scenery through the window. You can stay in my house for the duration of your employment, he finally said. I gasped and snapped my gaze to his. I was lost for words, something that happened rarely. He smiled, sending my already rapidly beating heart plunging. Well, he prompted. I sounded witless, but I couldn't think of an excuse to refuse him. Live under the same roof as a foreigner who was quite possibly a gunslinger? I'd be mad to consider it. I shouldn't. It wouldn't be proper. You don't seem like you're in a position to worry about what's proper. At my second gasp, he merely shrugged. Are you? No, I hedged, but it's not polite to point that out to a woman in reduced circumstances. My apologies. The rules surrounding politeness here are numerous. I'm not familiar with them all yet. You're forgiven. So is that a definite refusal of my offer? I should say that it was without hesitation. I ought to insist on finding my own accommodation. But it would be wonderful not to have to worry about it for the week. And living in the same house as Mr. Glass would make it easier to spy on him and learn the truth. If I locked my door at night and slept with a knife under my pillow, then I ought to be safe. Besides, the newspaper article didn't say the outlaw attacked women, only stole horses and robbed stagecoaches. Aside from the murder, that is. I had nothing of value for him to steal, and I wasn't a lawman. If I learned something that connected him to the man in the newspaper, I would tell only the police and not give him so much as a hint of my suspicions. I'll stay with you only if I live in the servants' quarters and you tell everyone that I am your housekeeper or maid, I said. I employ charwomen, not maids. My female cousin came over with me and is staying in the house. Does having another woman present make you feel more at ease? Yes, it does. Then consider yourself a temporary guest of number 16 Park Street, Mayfair. The speed at which the decision had been made was dizzying. It took a moment to sink in that I was about to live like a duchess in one of London's best addresses for a week. When it did finally sink in, I had to bite the inside of my lip to hide my smile. Mr. Glass didn't hide his. It's a nice house, he said, his tone teasing. It's a little larger than what I'm used to, but I like it. Thank you, I said. It's very kind of you. Oh, that reminds me. I opened my reticule and removed his handkerchief. Thank you for this. I don't know where I'd be without it. Glad I could be of assistance. The way he said it didn't make me feel at all wretched for my situation. On the contrary, I felt like I'd done him a favour by accepting his offer of work. I supposed I had. The only other people who could point out all the watchmakers in the city were already in gainful employment and wouldn't be available for the time-consuming task. He pocketed the handkerchief and, as his hand moved away, he went to touch the coat pocket that he'd touched several times the day before, only to check himself. He glanced at me and smiled again, but I wasn't fooled. He was looking to see if I'd noticed. I smiled back, pretending that I hadn't. Cyclops pulled to the side of the road near Marble Arch, and Mr. Glass assisted me from the coach.
No more than 3 hours,
Cyclops called down.
Sir.
Mr. Glass held up his hand in dismissal and waited at the curb for the traffic to ease. After a moment, I said, We'll have to take our chances in that gap. With one hand holding onto my hat and the other picking up my skirts, we dashed across to the Oxford Street side. Is the traffic as bad as this where you're from? I asked, as we passed by a draper's shop where lovely red silk had been displayed to best catch the morning light. No, Mr. Glass said. I tore my gaze away from the silks at his curt answer. It took a moment before I realised he wouldn't want to give me too much information about himself if he were an outlaw. The notion both thrilled and worried me. Do you live in a city or village? I pressed on, nevertheless. A large town at present, but I've lived all over the world. Really? Where precisely? France, Italy, Prussia, and now America. Where in America? Here and there. He sidestepped around a boy carrying an empty crate on his shoulder and waited for me to catch up. He shortened his strides to keep a pace with me. You mentioned a place in New Mexico, I went on. Broken Creek, was it? Yes. How long did you live there? I didn't live there. Then where do you live? You ask a lot of questions, Miss Steele. I'm naturally inquisitive, but if I'm to live in your house, I'd feel more comfortable if I knew you better. There. That didn't sound at all suspiciously nosy, simply cautious. This looks like our first stop, he said, nodding at the sign jutting out from the doorway, still some shops away. He was definitely avoiding answering. Mr. Thompson's shop was not unlike my father's or Mr. Mason's, although somewhat smaller. Rent was higher on Oxford Street, and there was no space for a workshop at the back. I happened to know that Mr. Thompson no longer made watches or clocks, but sold ones manufactured in Clerkenwell factories. Mr. Thompson looked up from the cabinet, where he was rearranging watches, and smiled at Mr. Glass. He turned to me, and the smile faded. Miss Steele, what are you doing here? He backed away and rounded the counter bench, placing it between us. Good morning, Mr. Thompson. I said, stepping up to the counter. He moved to the side, away from me. I followed, but he moved a little farther again and made a great fuss over the selection of watch chains laid out on a velvet mat. His gaze slid sideways, watching me. I hadn't seen Mr. Thompson in 2 years, and clearly I hadn't changed, or he wouldn't have recognised me. He'd been amiable to me back then, so why this odd behaviour now? "This is Mr. Glass," I said. "He's looking for a particular watchmaker who went to America some 5 years ago." Mr. Thompson glanced at Mr. Glass and nodded a greeting. "He would be older than you are, Mr. Thompson," Mr. Glass said. "Do you know of any watchmakers who were in America around that time? He would be quite old now. Your father, perhaps?" Mr. Thompson, who was about my father's age, shook his head. "My father was a chandler, not a watchmaker, and I don't know anyone who's been to America. Do you wish to purchase a new watch, sir, or clock?" "Not today." Mr. Thompson cleared his throat, looked at me, then pointedly at the door. He couldn't have been clearer if he'd shouted "Get out" at the top of his voice. I marched out of the shop, Mr. Glass at my heels. I puzzled on Mr. Thompson's greeting until we reached the next watchmaker, a narrow shop of little more than a door's width, wedged between a jeweller and a tobacconist. Mr. Baxter, the proprietor, had been a friend to my father and one of the few to come to his funeral, although he'd not stayed after the ceremony. I expected a hearty, friendly greeting at least, as he was a blustery, generous man whose character was as big as his barrel chest. Yet he too stood behind his counter to speak to me, as if it were a shield to hide behind, if necessary. Unlike Mr. Thompson, Mr. Baxter could hardly look at me and seemed quite ill at ease, something that I would never have associated with him. We asked our questions, he gave brief answers, and Mr. Glass and I left without being any closer to finding Kronos. We had to cross busy Oxford Street to get to the next shop on my list, one that I'd been dreading before and felt even more anxious about now, after being received so strangely by both Mr. Thompson and Mr. Baxter. I couldn't even describe their receptions as frosty. It was as if they were wary of me. Perhaps they expected me to argue with them over their refusal to allow me into the guild. They had, after all, voted against my admission, along with the other members. But it was the next watchmaker on my list who'd been most vehement in refusing me, according to Father after he returned home the night of the vote. Mr. Abercrombie was president of the guild and had held the position for the past few years because no one dared speak against him. He had inherited a fortune as well as the shop from his father, and so could afford the best tools and supplies. The Queen had purchased a clock from his father some 30 years ago, and Mr. Abercrombie had made an excellent living off the claim ever since. He now boasted the custom of princes and lords, and had 4 staff working for him in his shop alone. He wielded power within the guild, with every other member bowing to his wishes. If he didn't want a watchmaker to belong to the guild, then he wouldn't be allowed in. Every member would vote as Mr. Abercrombie advised. And if a watchmaker couldn't belong to the guild, he couldn't legally sell watches in England. It was why Father had been so upset when my application had been refused, and it explained why he'd given the shop to Eddie instead of me. Eddie, as a man, was admitted. Abercrombie's fine watches and clocks was triple the size of Mr. Thompson's shop and occupied a prominent corner. Mr. Glass held the door open for me, but I shook my head. "You go in and ask your questions without me," I said. "My presence is not required." He glanced back across the street to Baxter's, frowned slightly, then nodded. "Very well." I watched through the window. The slender figure of Mr. Abercrombie stood in the centre of the shop, his hands at his back. With his oiled moustache and pince-nez perched on the edge of his nose, he looked as respectable as any of his royal clients. He directed one of his staff to take Mr. Glass's hat and coat, but Mr. Glass refused. He spoke, and Mr. Abercrombie responded with a quizzical expression. He spoke, presumably to offer to look at Mr. Glass's special watch instead. Although his back was to me, I could see Mr. Glass heave a sigh. He must be tired of hearing the same responses. Mr. Abercrombie spread out his hands to indicate all his wonderful wares. My gaze followed the motion, and I couldn't stop staring at the lovely mahogany long-case clock with the brass dial displayed behind the counter. It was quite a spectacular piece. Movement caught my eye, and suddenly Mr. Abercrombie came marching through the door. He caught my arm before I could run off. "It is you." He peered over the top of his pince-nez at me. If the rabid look in his eye didn't make me shrink away, his stinking breath certainly did. "What are you doing here, Miss Steele?" I swallowed and tried to pull away from him, but he held me too tightly. I'm just shopping, Mr. Abercrombie. Let me go, please, or I'll scream." "Go ahead and scream. I'll tell everyone you stole from me." I gasped. "Why would you do that? Why do you hate me so?" His only response was to dig his fingers in more. I winced as the nails bit through my sleeve to my skin. "Unhand, Miss Steele," came the low growl from behind Mr. Abercrombie. I hadn't seen Mr. Glass emerge from the shop, but he now appeared over the watchmaker's shoulder, a dark scowl scoring his forehead, his eyes as black as thunderclouds. "You know her?" Mr. Abercrombie said, not letting me go. "What is this? What's going on?" I said, "Unhand her, now." If I were Mr. Abercrombie, and Mr. Glass had spoken to me in such a fearsome way, I would have done what he demanded, and quickly. But Mr. Abercrombie didn't. "Tell me what it is you really want, or I'll accuse her of theft," he said. "You can't accuse me of stealing when I've nothing of yours," I snapped. "Let me go, Mr. Abercrombie, you're hurting me." The blood had indeed stopped flowing to my lower arm and hand. My fingers throbbed. Mr. Abercrombie pulled me against him, grinned in my face, and slipped something inside my pocket. I didn't need to look to know that it would be a watch. "Thief!" Mr. Abercrombie cried. "Someone fetch a constable! I've caught a thief!"